What if the recipes that built the strongest generation of Americans, the people who raised you, who worked the factories and the fields and the coal mines, and came home on Friday evenings and fed 6 people from one pot, have been sitting, forgotten, in yellowed notebooks and church cookbooks and the backs of recipe card boxes since the day the women who made them stopped cooking? The 1950s American kitchen did not have meal kits. It did not have delivery apps. It did not have 47 varieties of pasta sauce on the grocery shelf. It had a cast iron skillet, a bag of flour, whatever the week's paycheck had left behind, and a woman who knew exactly what to do with all of it. These are not just recipes. They are the survival skills of a generation that raised America on a budget that would make most of us sit down in disbelief. Today, we journey through 25 forgotten Friday night comfort meals from the 1950s that no one makes anymore. Creamed chipped beef on toast. Creamed chipped beef on toast. The men who had served in the military knew it by a colorful name that could not be repeated at a family table. Back home, mothers served it to hungry children without the crude nickname, and the children asked for it by Friday without knowing it had any name but supper. During the Depression years and both World Wars, dried beef kept without refrigeration and stretched further than any fresh cut of meat could manage. When fresh meat became impossible to afford for working families from textile towns in the Carolinas to factory neighborhoods in Ohio, this preserved protein fed hungry children on a fraction of what a butcher's cut would have cost. Families turned to it not as surrender, but as solution. The recipe couldn't be simpler. Melt butter in a heavy pan and stir in flour until it smells faintly nutty. Pour in milk slowly, stirring constantly until the sauce thickens to the consistency of cream. Tear paper-thin dried beef into the sauce and let it simmer until the salt of the meat flavors everything around it, the whole thing turning pale and rich and deeply savory. Served over thick white toast, it becomes golden and comforting and surprisingly filling. Tuna noodle casserole. Tuna noodle casserole. Perhaps no single dish better captures the particular ingenuity of 1950s Friday night cooking, when Catholic families across America needed something without meat that the children would actually eat without complaint, and the budget could actually sustain without strain. During the decade when the Catholic population of the United States was approaching its historic peak, Meatless Fridays shaped the weekly cooking of millions of households from Boston to Los Angeles. When families turned to the pantry for something that could feed 6 without breaking the grocery budget, the answer was almost always a can of tuna, a bag of egg noodles, and a can of cream of mushroom soup. Families in Italian immigrant neighborhoods in Chicago and Irish Catholic communities in Boston and farm families in Indiana all arrived at the same solution independently and recognized it as correct. Chicken pot pie. Chicken pot pie. Nothing speaks more warmly about the resourcefulness of 1950s Friday night cooking than this pie, which transformed whatever remained of a roasted chicken into something that felt more generous than the original bird had been. During the decade when whole chickens were a practical staple even in tight household budgets, farm families and factory workers' wives across the country developed an almost automatic practice of stretching a single bird across multiple meals through the week. Nothing went to waste when there were children to feed, and a grocery budget that required every ingredient to earn its place twice. The chicken that roasted on Wednesday became stock on Thursday, and on Friday, whatever meat remained came off the bone and went into a pot pie that fed the entire family and left the table feeling they had eaten well. Salmon patties. Salmon patties. Nothing speaks more directly to the thrifty genius of 1950s home cooking than this dish, which turned a single can of fish into a full dinner for 4 and left enough for sandwiches the next morning. During the decade when canned pink salmon was one of the most affordable proteins in any American grocery store, farm families in the South and working-class families in the Midwest reached for it on Friday nights with the confidence of women who understood exactly what they were doing with limited resources. When fresh fish was unaffordable or unavailable miles from any coastline, families turned to the can and found that the small pink salmon it contained delivered protein, calcium from its softened bones, and a flavor that held up beautifully to pan frying in butter. Drain the can and flake the salmon into a bowl, leaving the small bones because the canning process has softened them completely.
Macaroni and cheese. Macaroni and cheese. Not from the blue box that arrived in 1937 and changed everything, but the homemade version that working-class kitchens maintained throughout the 1950s, made from scratch in a heavy pot with real cheddar and real butter and whole milk, baked in the oven until the top formed a golden crust that everyone fought over. During the post-war years, when families were building new households on factory wages and farm incomes that left little room for excess, homemade baked macaroni and cheese appeared on Friday night tables across the American South and Midwest as a meal that cost almost nothing and satisfied completely. When the habit of meatless cooking that wartime rationing had established lingered into the more prosperous decade that followed, families turned to this dish as a reliable source of protein and comfort that asked almost nothing of the grocery budget and delivered everything the table required. Sardines on toast. Sardines on toast. Nothing speaks more plainly about the resourcefulness of 1950s Friday night cooking than the tin of sardines, which cost less than almost anything else in the grocery store and delivered more protein per penny than nearly any other food a working family could buy. During the decade when canned sardines were a pantry staple in working-class households from the New England coast to the Gulf ports, Portuguese immigrant families in New Bedford and Fall River and Italian immigrant families along the mid-Atlantic seaboard understood something that their American-born neighbors were still learning. The small, oily fish in the tin was not a compromise. When fresh fish was unaffordable and the Catholic Friday demanded something without meat, families turned to the sardine with the pragmatism of people who had been feeding themselves from the sea for generations and knew exactly what they had. Today, nutritionists call sardines one of the most nutritionally complete foods available. The families who ate them every Friday never needed anyone to tell them that. Ham and beans soup. Ham and beans soup. The Monday to Friday journey of a single ham bone that began as Sunday dinner and arrived at Friday night as something richer and deeper and more satisfying than the original meal that produced it. During the 1950s, when a Sunday ham represented one of the week's most significant grocery expenditures for working families, the understanding that nothing from that ham would be wasted was not a philosophy, it was arithmetic. Nothing went to waste when there were 6 mouths to feed, and the grocery money had been carefully counted before it was spent. The bone went into a pot on Monday morning with dried navy beans and the onion, and it simmered on the back of the stove through the week, deepening and enriching, until by Friday night it had become something the family looked forward to specifically. Soak dried navy beans overnight, then combine them in a heavy pot with the ham bone, diced onion, carrot, and celery. Cover with water and let it all simmer for hours, the beans slowly softening, the marrow releasing from the bone into the broth, the smokiness of the cured ham working its way through every cup of liquid until the whole pot smells of something ancient and deeply satisfying. Season with black pepper and serve with cornbread. Beef stew. Beef stew. Perhaps no Friday night dish better represents the transformation that working-class American cooks performed on the cheapest cuts of meat, turning something tough and inexpensive into something tender and rich and deeply flavored through nothing more expensive than patience and time. During the 1950s, when stew beef from the chuck was among the most affordable options at the butcher counter, factory workers' families and farm households across the Midwest and the South built Friday night suppers around it with the confidence of women who had been doing this for decades. When roasts and steaks sat beyond the weekly budget, families turned to the cuts that required time rather than money and made something that tasted, by the time it reached the table, like genuine abundance. Melt a little fat in a heavy pot and brown the beef in batches until each piece develops a dark, fragrant crust that smells of caramelized protein and something deeply savory. Remove the meat and cook diced onion in the drippings until it softens and goes golden. Return the beef with carrots, potatoes, celery, a bay leaf, and enough water or broth to cover. Let it simmer for 2 hours, the broth thickening slowly as the collagen in the cheap cuts dissolves into something silky and rich.
Pork chops and applesauce. Pork chops and applesauce. A Friday night pairing so thoroughly embedded in the American household of the 1950s that it became the subject of a television comedy, which is itself evidence of how universally recognized it was in the working-class homes that never appeared on television at all. During the post-war decade, pork was often the most affordable meat at the butcher counter, and farm families who raised their own hogs understood that pork chops represented genuine value for a working household. When beef prices climbed beyond the reach of the weekly grocery budget, families turned to the pig with the pragmatism of people who had survived harder times and recognized a practical solution when they found one. The applesauce came from the mason jars a grandmother had put up in the fall, or from the store shelf when the garden had not cooperated. And either way, it cost almost nothing and provided exactly what was needed. Spaghetti with meat sauce. Spaghetti with meat sauce. Nothing speaks more directly to the influence of Italian immigrant communities on working-class American Friday night cooking than this dish, which traveled from the neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan and South Philadelphia and the Hill District of Pittsburgh into the general American household, and settled there so completely that within a generation, it no longer needed an origin story. During the decades when Italian immigrant communities built their presence in American industrial cities, the Friday night supper of pasta and a long-simmered meat sauce became both a cultural expression and a practical solution to the challenge of feeding large families on factory wages. When Italian families who had brought this tradition from the south of Italy found their American neighbors watching and asking how it was made, the recipe traveled across back fences and church socials and community cookbooks with the efficiency of something that solved a genuine problem beautifully and tasted better than anything it was replacing. Franks and beans. Franks and beans. A Friday night supper that carried no pretension and required no apology, and that fed factory workers and their families across the industrial Northeast and Midwest with reliable efficiency for decades, without anyone thinking to question whether it belonged on a dinner table. During the 1950s, when hot dogs were among the least expensive proteins in any American grocery store, and canned pork and beans required no preparation beyond opening the can, working-class families developed a Friday night practice of combining them in a baking dish with brown sugar and mustard and ketchup, and letting the oven do the remaining work while the family settled into the one evening the week belonged to them. When fresh meat was beyond the budget, and the children were hungry and the week had demanded everything the household had, franks and beans appeared on the table without ceremony and was eaten with genuine satisfaction. Welsh rarebit. Welsh rarebit. Perhaps no Friday night dish better demonstrates the quiet sophistication that working-class American cooks could achieve with the simplest possible ingredients than this one, which managed to taste like something elaborate while requiring nothing more than cheese, bread, and the knowledge of what to do with them. During the 1950s, when a block of sharp cheddar represented one of the most affordable proteins at the grocery counter, and bread was a staple in every household, regardless of income, working-class families across the country discovered that melted cheese over toast could be elevated far beyond its humble origins through the addition of mustard, Worcestershire sauce, and a little ale or milk. When the grocery money had run thin before Friday arrived, and the pantry held little beyond the block of cheese kept as a matter of routine, families turned to that cheese and found it could become dinner through the application of skill rather than expense. Potato soup. Potato soup. A Friday night supper that appeared in working-class households across the country with the regularity of something essential. Because in the weeks when the grocery money had run out before Friday arrived, it was. During the 1950s, when potatoes could be purchased in 5-pound bags for pennies and were grown in backyard gardens across the country as a matter of practical routine, farm families and factory workers' households across the Midwest and the South discovered that a pot of potato soup could feed 6 people from ingredients that cost almost nothing and leave everyone genuinely satisfied. When the budget had been stretched to its limit by Wednesday, families turned to the potato bin and found that flour and milk and a little onion could transform what they found there into something far more substantial than the ingredients alone suggested. Egg noodles with butter. Egg noodles with butter. A Friday night supper that arrived in American working-class households through Central and Eastern European immigrant communities and settled there quietly, feeding Hungarian and Czech and Polish families and their American-born neighbors with something that asked almost nothing of the grocery budget and delivered a particular kind of comfort that more elaborate meals sometimes could not match. During the 1950s, when dried egg noodles were available in every grocery store for pennies, and butter was a refrigerator staple in nearly every household, regardless of income, immigrant families who had brought this tradition from the old country found that it translated without loss into the American kitchen. When the week had been particularly difficult and the grocery money had been depleted before Friday, families turned to the egg noodle and the butter and made something that felt, through the particular miracle of familiarity, like exactly what was needed. Cook egg noodles in well-salted boiling water until tender, drain them thoroughly, and toss them immediately with a generous amount of butter that melts from the heat of the pasta into a glossy coating. Add poppy seeds if the family had them, and toss again until every strand is coated. Season with salt and serve immediately in deep bowls while still steaming. Corn chowder. Corn chowder. A Friday night soup that appeared on farm family tables across the Midwest and New England throughout the 1950s, with the unassuming regularity of something that had simply always been there, feeding large families from a single pot for almost nothing, and asking nothing in return but a little time at the stove. During the decade when canned corn cost pennies and potatoes were a staple grown in backyard gardens across the country, farm families and working-class households discovered that corn chowder could feed 6 people for the cost of a can of corn, 2 potatoes, an onion, some salt pork, and a cup of milk. When the harvest had disappointed, or the week had stretched longer than the paycheck, families turned to what the pantry held and found that these simple ingredients could become something thick and creamy and warming that satisfied on the coldest Friday evenings.
Fry diced salt pork in a heavy pot until the fat renders and the pieces crisp and turn golden. Cook diced onion in the fat until soft and translucent. Add diced potato with enough water or broth to cover and simmer until the potato is completely tender. Add corn and whole milk and let the chowder warm through gently without boiling, which would curdle the milk and break the soup. Season with salt and white pepper and serve with crackers or thick bread. Rice pudding. Rice pudding. Perhaps no Friday night dessert of the 1950s demonstrates more elegantly the art of transforming what remained from an earlier meal into something that felt like a deliberate treat rather than a resourceful afterthought, turning Wednesday's leftover rice into a dessert the children requested by name. During the lean post-war years and the stretched budgets that characterized much of the decade beneath its prosperous surface, working-class families discovered that cooked rice combined with milk and eggs and sugar and a scraping of vanilla could be baked into something the children ate with the enthusiasm they reserved for far more expensive pleasures. Nothing went to waste when there were hungry mouths and a grocery budget that required every ingredient to earn its place in the pantry twice. Families turned to the leftover rice in the pot and found it could become something that tasted, by the time it came out of the oven, like Sunday. Bread pudding. Bread pudding. A Friday night dessert that, in the 1950s, carried the particular dignity of something made from what others discarded, transforming stale bread into a dessert that wealthier households paid cooks to produce and working-class families made because they understood instinctively that nothing worth eating should be thrown away. During the decades when bread was a staple in every household, and stale bread was an inevitability, farm families and working-class households across the South and Midwest developed a practice of saving the heels and the stale slices through the week and baking them on Friday into something that ate like a cake. Nothing went to waste in households where the grocery budget required every ingredient to justify its presence. Families turned to the bread that had hardened on the counter and found it was, in the hands of someone who understood what it could become, as valuable as a fresh loaf.
Vinegar pie. Vinegar pie. Nothing speaks more directly to the determined ingenuity of American home cooks during scarce times than this pie, which achieved the bright, tart quality of something fruity from nothing more than sugar, eggs, butter, vinegar, and a handful of spices. Because fruit was unaffordable, and the need for something sweet at the end of a hard week was not. During the Depression years and through the wartime rationing of the 1940s and into the leaner households of the early 1950s, farm families across the South and the rural Midwest discovered that apple cider vinegar, diluted with water and sweetened with sugar and thickened with eggs, could produce a custard filling that tasted faintly of citrus and strongly of something worth eating. When fresh fruit was too expensive and dried fruit had been used up, families turned to the vinegar in the pantry and made something from it that the table received as a genuine treat. Onion soup. Onion soup. A Friday night supper that in French culinary tradition had always been considered the food of the working poor, and that working-class American families in the 1950s adopted with the practical appreciation of people who recognized a good solution when they found one. During the hard inflation years that punctuated the decade's general prosperity, factory workers' families and farm households discovered that a bag of onions, which cost almost nothing and kept for weeks, could be transformed through the patient application of butter and thyme into something that tasted rich and complex and deeply satisfying. When meat was beyond the week's budget and the pantry held little beyond staples, families turned to the onion and found that its flavor, when coaxed slowly from pale sharpness into sweet caramelized depth,
could carry a whole supper on its own. Tomato rice soup with grilled cheese. The supper that paired a thin tomato rice soup with a crisp grilled cheese, the most comforting dollar a family ever spent. A can of tomato soup cost 10 cents in 1972. Today, around $1.19. Rice, bread, butter, and cheese. Total then under 50 cents. Today, under $4. Fed 4. You simmer tomato soup with cooked rice and a little milk. You grill cheese sandwiches in butter until golden. You serve them together. The soup goes red and creamy. The rice gives it body. The grilled cheese crunches alongside. Tomato rice soup with grilled cheese came from American Depression era and mid-century cooking. By 1972, it was a rainy day comfort supper nationwide. $1's worth of pure comfort on a cold night. Egg drop hamburger soup. The thin, savory soup that stretched a little ground beef with ribbons of egg dropped into hot broth. Ground beef cost 39 cents a pound in 1973. Today, around $5.50. Eggs, onion, and broth. Total then under 70 cents. Today, under $6. Fed 5. You brown a little beef with onion. You add broth and bring it to a boil. You slowly pour beaten egg in while stirring to make ribbons. The broth goes savory. The egg forms silky ribbons. The beef flavors everything. Egg drop hamburger soup came from thrifty American interpretations of Chinese egg drop soup. By 1973, it was a budget comfort supper nationwide. A little beef, a couple eggs, a whole pot of warmth. Hot milk cake. The simple, golden cake made from hot milk, eggs, and sugar. $1 dessert that tasted like a bakery. Eggs cost 50 cents a dozen in 1972. Today, around $3.49. Flour, sugar, milk, and butter. Total then under 60 cents. Today, under $4. Fed 12. You beat eggs and sugar until thick. You add flour, then hot milk with melted butter. You bake at 350 for 30 minutes. The cake goes golden and tender. The crumb is fine and moist. It tastes far richer than its cost. Hot milk cake came from American home baking traditions dating to the early 1900s. By 1972, it was a budget dessert standard nationwide. $1 cake that tasted like it came from a bakery. $1 was never just $1 in her hands. It was a warm supper, a full table, and the quiet refusal to let a hard week mean a hungry one. Chicken livers and rice. The rich, savory supper that simmered cheap chicken livers in gravy over rice. Chicken livers cost 29 cents a pound in 1973. Today, around $2.49. Onion, flour, broth, and rice. Total then under 60 cents. Today, under $5. Fed 4. You brown the livers with onion. You whisk in flour and broth to make gravy. You simmer 10 minutes and serve over rice. The livers go rich and tender. The gravy goes dark and savory. The rice soaks it up. Chicken livers and rice came from Southern and immigrant thrift cooking. By 1973, it was a budget comfort supper nationwide. The cheapest cut turned into the richest gravy. Poor man's pizza. The English muffin pizza. A quick, cheap supper that gave children pizza without a pizzeria. English muffins cost 29 cents in 1973. Today, around $2.49. Tomato sauce and cheese. Total then under 60 cents. Today, under $5. Fed 4. You split English muffins. You spread tomato sauce and cheese on each. You broil until the cheese bubbles. The muffin goes crisp. The cheese melts and browns. The sauce ties it together. English muffin pizzas came from American home cooking in the 1960s and 1970s. By 1973, they were a children's comfort supper nationwide. Pizza for pennies, straight from the broiler. Fried apples and biscuits. The Southern breakfast for supper of cinnamon sugar fried apples spooned over hot biscuits. Apples cost almost nothing in fall. Butter, sugar, cinnamon, and biscuits. Total then under 40 cents. Today under $4. Fed 5. You fry sliced apples in butter with sugar and cinnamon until soft. You split hot biscuits and spoon the apples over. The apples go soft and caramelized. The biscuits soak up the syrup. The cinnamon fills the kitchen. Fried apples and biscuits came from Appalachian and Southern cooking. By the 1970s, it was a comfort supper across the South. Cinnamon apples over hot biscuits, supper or breakfast. Cheese and potato pierogi. The Polish dumplings filled with cheesy mashed potato and boiled, then fried in butter and onion. Potatoes cost 20 cents for 5 pounds in 1973, today around $3. Flour, egg, cheese, and onion. Total then under 60 cents, today under $5. Fed 6. You make a dough and fill it with cheesy mashed potato. You boil the pierogi, then fry them in butter and onion. The dough goes tender, the filling stays creamy. The butter and onion crisp the edges. Pierogi came from Polish and Eastern European immigrant traditions. By the 1970s, they were a comfort supper in working-class homes nationwide. Polish dumplings that turned potatoes into a feast. Skillet corn and bacon. Frozen corn is about $1 for a cup. 2 strips of bacon, roughly 60 cents. Butter and pepper. Under $2 total. You render the bacon until it curls and the fat runs clear. You drop the corn straight into the hot fat and it snaps and pops. In 4 minutes, it goes from pale yellow to golden brown at the edges. The smell is smoke and sweetness together. This is Southern skillet corn, documented in Kentucky and Tennessee cookbooks going back to the 1890s. It was supper on nights when there was corn and there was fat back, and that was enough. 1 skillet, 4 minutes. No standing over a hot stove with a heavy pot. And it delivers real protein and real fat, which older bodies need more of, not less. Milk gravy on potato. 1 potato, 50 cents. A cup of milk, 30 cents. Butter, flour, black pepper. Under $1. The potato goes in the microwave for 6 minutes. While it cooks, you make the gravy. Butter, flour, milk, whisked until it thickens and coats the back of a spoon. Heavy black pepper. You split the potato and it steams. You pour the gravy in and it pools in the hollow. Appalachian, and it kept coal families alive through the 1920s and 30s, when meat was a Sunday thing and milk gravy was every other day. 6 minutes in a microwave and 3 minutes at a stove. No lifting a heavy pot. No draining boiling water, which is the single most dangerous thing an older cook does in a kitchen. Boarding house peas and toast. A cup of frozen peas, 60 cents. Butter, flour, milk, 2 slices of bread. Under $1.50. You make a cream sauce, drop the peas in, and they turn bright green in 90 seconds. You spoon them over toast. The bread goes soft where the sauce sits and stays crisp at the crust. A woman in a Pennsylvania boarding house invented this in 1948, feeding 14 people on $11 a week. It spread through 3 states within a decade, carried by the boarders who left and never forgot it. Soft, warm, and the peas mean you get a vegetable in without any chopping, peeling, or standing. For anyone whose energy runs out by 5 in the afternoon, that matters more than any nutrition chart. Wilted lettuce with hot bacon dressing. Lettuce, 60 cents. 2 strips of bacon, 60 cents. Vinegar, sugar, salt. Under $1.50. You crisp the bacon and pour the hot fat straight over a bowl of torn lettuce. It collapses on contact, going glossy and dark. You splash vinegar into the hot pan and it steams up sharp. That goes over the top too. Appalachian and Pennsylvania Dutch, and this was the first meal of spring for 200 years, the moment the first greens came up. Raw greens are hard on an older digestive system. Wilted greens are not. This is how you eat a salad when a salad has stopped agreeing with you. And it takes 4 minutes. Continuing from where it cut off.